We BeeChicas feel a great kinship with Susan because she understands deeply how gardens can be so much more than just a pretty place in front of your house. She leads the movement to make the spaces around us into beautiful and hardworking parts of our ecosystem, which includes not only the plants, but insects, birds, all the creatures, and also the humans that live within our ecosystem. Susan has an impressive body of written works, including many books and articles for High Country News, Rocky Mountain Gardening, Los Angeles Times. I could go on and on and on, and that's just a few of them. Her most recent book, Bless the Birds, is a beautiful memoir which won the Sarton Women's Book Award and is available in the lobby along with about 4 other of her books if you'd like to purchase one for Susan to sign after the event. So look also for her impressive list of many, many more accomplishments on her website, and her fascinating blog and podcast appearances are also available there. Many of you may know Susan as the unforgettable speaker from many Colorado native plant conferences, which she also has helped to organize. She journeyed to Boulder from her home near Santa Fe, but Susan is no stranger to Colorado, having lived and restored landscapes and gardens here for years. So we are so fortunate to have you here, Susan, with us tonight to inspire us with the story of the fantastical world of everyday nature in and around us. Thank you so much for being here, and welcome, Susan.
Thank you. Well, hi. I don't actually have to say anything now, right? First, I just want to say thanks to BeeChicas for dreaming up this fabulous series. They've been doing educational stuff, especially with kids and related to gardens, but the speaking series is a whole new dream of theirs, and I'm thrilled to be the first speaker, and thanks to Boulder Public Library for housing us and setting up the technology, which was not simple, and publicizing the event. And thank you all for coming here on a Wednesday evening and giving your time and attention to hear about the fantastical world of everyday nature in and around us. Let's see if I can make this work. Oh, look, I can. If you go away with one thing from this talk, I want you to leave with a sense that we are not alone in the world, either as individual humans or as a species, and that in fact, the skin boundary, the skin that contains what we think of as us, is not an individual. You are an ecosystem. And as such, when we talk about humans and nature as if we're somehow separate, that is so not true. We are part of nature, whether we want to be or not. It's not a choice we make. This quote comes from an art installation that an art collective with the fabulous name of Marshmallow Laser Frost Art Collective, and I don't know where that name came from. They did an installation where the viewers can actually enter into, in the virtual world, a tropical forest and feel the beat of life around you, hear the respiration of the trees and the other beings in that tropical forest, and be part of that forest in a really deep way, which is actually how we are in life all the time. We just don't pay attention to it. And as part of the text, they said, we imagine ourselves as sealed off individuals, but our bodies are porous. Think about that. Our bodies are porous, infused with the world around us, home to thousands of microscopic, symbiotic inhabitants, big words that mean little tiny critters too small for us to see even with our bifocals or our magnifying glasses, that are cooperators in our lives. So we're full of microscopic beings, and they're critical to our lives, sharing nutrients, life, and breath. We discover that our idea of separateness between one being and the next is an illusion. So I want to talk about fantastical things. The first fantastical thing is that we are not alone at all in this world, even when we think we are. And this is a photo of When the Colorado big bike race was coming through Salida, where I used to live, all those bodies crammed together reminded me of the way microbes act inside our bodies, in synchrony, more or less. You are microbial. As the science writer Ed Yong writes in his brilliant book, We Contain Multitudes, or I Contain Multitudes, what you think of as you is far outnumbered by the cells of your microbiome, these little microscopic critters who live in and on you. If that creeps you out and you don't prefer it, let me just say you're going to die, because those little microscopic beings, some 10,000 species, which is not individuals, that's kinds of microbes, 10,000 kinds, or 15 in some people, they are so much a part of who we are, these bacteria, archaea, fungi, and viruses, which are mostly beneficial, by the way. They mostly come in friendship. There are a few, like with humans, who we would really prefer not to have around, but you take those with all the others. Microbes help digest our food. They keep our skin, our mucosal surfaces, the insides of our noses and ears and all the other mucosal parts of our bodies, and our organs healthy. They regulate our emotions and our brain chemistry. It turns out that we're now learning that some mental disorders are related to an imbalance in the kinds of microbes we have living in us, because there's a big communication between your gut and your brain. It's a feedback loop. Who you have living in your gut is related to what your emotions and how healthy your brain chemistry is, and how healthy your emotions and your brain chemistry is related to who you have living in your gut. So eat yogurt, the kind with probiotics, and cut back on the sugar and Coca-Cola and all that stuff. They also help our immune system work and help it defeat diseases, and they assist in literally our functioning as what we think of as us. As me, I am a community of microbes. There's something like 10 times as many microbial cells in your body as human cells, as what we define as human cells, which is sobering and interesting. So, whoops, wait. I got ahead of myself. One of our primary relationships as humans is with microbes. Another primary relationship is with plants. And most of us spend very little time thinking about plants unless you're a gardener or a restorer of ecosystems. Most of us humans are, and there's an actual diagnosis for this, plant blind. We are biased, our vision and our comprehension is biased towards movement. And plants move, but they move at a speed that we don't notice. You can take time-lapse photography of them and see them moving, but we, in our impatient quickness, don't notice that. So we are often literally plant blind. We don't see them except as a green backdrop. They're just there. They're rooted in place doing something, whatever they do. But it turns out that plants are critical to our lives because we breathe oxygen and we eat glucose, the sort of basic sugar of all of life. Plants are our breathing buddies, and that's a phrase I stole from my friend Clifford Burke, who's a poet, and he used it in a poem, and I was so struck by it. When we, starting with plants, they exhale their respiration. When they blow out what they don't need with their breath, they exhale oxygen. What do we breathe? What would we do if we couldn't breathe? Hold your breath and see how long you can hold it. Just right now. Hold your breath. Just take a minute. You're starting to feel a little panicky. I know I am. Oxygen is life to us. But without plants respiring oxygen and green algae, the kind of algae that photosynthesizes, which is like pond slime on the little scale and giant kelp on the big scale, the underground forests off the Pacific coast of giant kelp, those beings are what sustain our lives because their out-breaths bring the percentage of oxygen in our Earth's atmosphere up to the point that will keep us alive. We oxygen breathers evolved because there was too much oxygen in the air from plants and green algae breathing out. And so we came along and started breathing it in. And what do we breathe out? Carbon dioxide. That's our waste gas. What do plants need to breathe in? Carbon dioxide. They use it to make the basis of all the food on Earth. Plants use the sun's energy plus carbon dioxide plus water and some minerals to make glucose, which is the basic food of all of life on Earth. Even if it comes through a cow's body or whatever else, glucose is what supports the food web of life. So we're breathing out carbon dioxide, they're breathing it in. They're breathing out oxygen, we're breathing it in. We have a reciprocal relationship. It's our most important reciprocal relationship is with plants, whom we don't pay attention to at all, or hardly at all, unless we're gardeners. Plants in photosynthesis, in making their food, using the sun's energy, so they're like the original solar cells. They use the energy in sunlight to make food, not Hershey bars. Glucose. There's a great new book out by a science journalist whose name is Zoe Schlanger, and the book is called The Light Eaters. And it's not fiction. It's about plants, because they essentially eat light to make glucose. So plants, she says every molecule of glucose that has ever passed through our bodies was first woven by a plant. And she further says that when you're thinking about this, your brain is consuming glucose. It's what fires the synapses in your brain. So when you're thinking about plants, you are consuming plant sugars to do that thinking. So plants are majorly important to us, even if we don't think about it much, even if we don't pay attention. And those, by the way, are sugar snap peas from my garden, and I thought that was appropriate since we'd be talking about plant sugars. They're delicious. So the second fantastical thing is that we now know, and when I was going to graduate school, I would have been laughed out of graduate school for saying this, plants talk. They don't use words. You're not going to have a plant up here on the stage giving you a talk in this series. But you might have a plant up here on the stage speaking in fragrances. Plants make a variety of what chemists call aromatic compounds, meaning smelly smells. And they broadcast them into the air and the soil as a way of communicating with each other. So, for instance, plants might say, "I taste bad, don't eat me." And if you've ever watched a deer here in Boulder browse on your garden or your neighbor's garden or a park or whatever, watch closely. They sniff before they bite. And the point of that is that the plant, they can tell how nutritious the plant is by the fragrances it's giving off. So if you're a wild rabbit brush outside a yard that's not getting watered and fertilized, the deer comes up and goes, not so great. I'll save that for when I'm starving, and moves on to the rose plant in your garden that you just watered and fertilized that week, and goes, "Oh yeah, good stuff. Munch, 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 munch." So plants say, "I taste bad, don't eat me." They say, "Deer coming, make yourself inedible." They have a whole set of complicated messages to talk to the insects and animals that pollinate them, that come and feed on their flowers and make it possible for them to have seeds. And that's a big relationship. So plants talk, which is something we haven't really thought about until recently. And there was a fabulous set of research done by a guy in California on big sagebrush, my very favorite plant in the world. Big sagebrush, which this is a close-up of its leaves. It's a shrub that you see all across the valleys and basins from the west side of the Rockies to the east side of the Sierras. It's the one that smells something like turpentine with orange blossoms and jasmine. If you've smelled big sagebrush, you never forget it, and you either love it or hate it. I happen to love it. It's a lung opener, and I have bad lungs, but I also love it. So sagebrush is super, super common, which means everybody wants to eat sagebrush, which means it's developed some pretty sophisticated communication systems to keep from being eaten and to warn its fellows about that. And this scientist who's an entomologist, Richard Carban, did this very clever set of experiments, and I just wanted to show you, give you a sense of big sagebrush across its range. That is a baby elk calf coming out of some big sagebrush in Yellowstone National Park where I was working. And that is a pronghorn antelope on a sagebrush ridge in western Colorado. And there's some really tall big sagebrush, the kind that get over my head, also in the northern Rockies. And by the way, big sagebrush is like the overstory, like it's the tree of its plant communities. It's the tall stuff that protects everybody else, shelters everybody else. About 150 species of animals and birds are dependent on it for some part of their lives, and I don't know how many insects and smaller critters. So it's a big, important plant. And because it's common, everybody just wants to eat it. So big sagebrush produces chemicals that make its leaves, especially the new tender spring leaves, taste bad. And they basically, the fragrance that those chemicals give off says, I'm going to clog up your guts like 12 donuts. So don't eat me. You'll be sorry. You'll have a stomach ache. Big sagebrush also, and this is what Richard Carban discovered and his students, if you clip branches off as if a browser has come along and injured the plant, it exudes aromatic compounds onto the air that other sagebrush take up, and it immediately causes them to change the chemical content of their foliage so that it's harder to digest within less than an hour, 20 minutes in some cases. So you clip pieces off the sagebrush as an experiment to injure it, and the shrub makes fragrances that it broadcasts on the air as a warning to other plants. Make yourself grazers here, deer descending or pronghorn descending or grasshoppers descending. You're going to get eaten to death unless you make yourself less edible. So the first thing Carban and his students discovered is that sagebrush talks to other sagebrush via these fragrances. The second thing they discovered is that when those fragrances are let out onto the air, other plants respond. So the blanket flowers and the other wildflowers in that community also make themselves less edible. Why would sagebrush care about the other plants in the community? Because it takes the whole community to be healthy, not just the ones that look and talk like you. It's a good lesson for people. So that's a pretty astonishing thing, and the cool thing about these studies with big sagebrush is that scientists had just started to look at plants in the lab, where you can do all sorts of manipulations easily, and then you wonder if it's like that out in the real world. And his experiments happened out in the real world, in his field site up in the Sierra Nevada mountains in California. So he and his students went out, and I love this idea. They're out there clipping branches off big sagebrush, and then they're putting plastic bags on other branches to keep those branches from sensing the aromatic compounds so they can see whether they respond or not. I mean, it's a hysterical picture, but that's science. Always fun, always interesting, and sometimes we look stupid doing it. So sagebrush isn't the only plant that talks. It's not the only plant that communicates. Tomatoes are a fabulous example of some pretty sophisticated communication. Do you know tomato hornworms? They're like sphinx moths. They're those big fat caterpillars that will totally defoliate your tomato plant, and then you get no tomatoes, and you're so bummed if you don't find them and squash them and feed them to the birds otherwise. So tomato plants can analyze the spit of the caterpillars that are eating them. Wait, what? Plants have no brain that we can recognize, but they can analyze the chemical compounds in the saliva of caterpillars eating them. Tomatoes can, so can corn and some other crop plants. And as they do that, they know what kind of caterpillar it is, so they then make aromatic compounds, smells, that they broadcast on the air to attract the particular parasitic wasp that will parasitize that caterpillar. For a plant that we can't see that has eyes or a brain, that's pretty darn sophisticated. So, how does that work? Well, what happens is when the tomato puts out a call to that particular parasitic wasp, and there's a white-lined sphinx moth, and there's a swallowtail caterpillar, and there is a tomato hornworm. What is on that tomato hornworm? Those are little chrysalises, little pupas. So what the female parasitic moth does is comes and lays her eggs. This is going to get really gross. So you may want to, put your fingers over your ears if you don't want to hear it. She lays her eggs by injecting eggs under the skin of the caterpillar. And then she flies off, and those eggs hatch inside the caterpillar's body into little larvae that eat the caterpillar from inside. Yeah, told you it's gross. And then when they are full, they make pupae on the outside, these silken cocoons on the outside of the caterpillar, and metamorphose into an adult wasp, split the cocoon, and fly away. Pretty huh? Okay, but it gets better, because some caterpillars have figured out how to change their diet while they're being parasitized, while the larvae are inside them, and in the doing starve the larvae out, and the caterpillar survives anyway. Woo! All right. And we think other species are just not as smart as we are. So, you just have to love that. So when I think about plants talking, I have one question. If plants use these scents, these fragrances, as a way of communicating, and people who study this say that different fragrances are their vocabulary. If that's the case, and if we humans use plant-based scents in our perfumes and aftershaves and lotions and all the other, our smelly candles, our car fragrances, all that stuff, and we're trailing those smells around us as we walk through the world, what are we saying? You gotta wonder, right? Wow. Okay. Third fantastical thing, metamorphosis. We all learned about metamorphosis, right? We all know what it is. You have a caterpillar, it spins a cocoon, it becomes a flying thing. It's a crawling thing, and it becomes a flying thing. Okay, no big deal. But wait, how does that actually work? So imagine, and this is a eastern black swallowtail caterpillar feeding on a Rocky Mountain bee plant in my garden. I grow them in with my edibles because they attract a lot of different pollinating insects, which also happen to be the ones who will lay their eggs on caterpillars eating my garden plants. So I grow wildflowers that will attract pollinators in my edible garden as a way of helping to control the pest insects, as we call them, those ones we don't want. So imagine that as a child you crawl on a dozen or so legs. They're stout, fat legs, and you eat 24/7. You just never stop eating. I mean, you eat when you're asleep. All you want to do is eat. It's all you think about. You munch on your host plant, and most butterflies and moths are pretty specific in their caterpillars' preferences. They don't just eat anything. They have a specific plant they focus on and eat, and that relates to the plant's chemistry, which relates to the plant's communication, and so on. So all you do is eat. And then after eating and growing, you become lethargic, maybe cranky, and if you've had teenagers, this will sound familiar. You shelter in a tent that you've woven over yourself. It's like pulling the covers over your head for a couple of weeks. And you fall into a dreaming state where you imagine that your muscles and skeletal system are rearranging themselves completely. Your gut shrinks and parts are repurposed to create sex organs. Your skin stretches and changes. Your nervous system grows new branches. And lumps of new tissue grow on your back, and they're all wet and clumped together, so you have no idea what they are. It's weird. And there we are. There's our caterpillar being a munch. That's an eastern black swallowtail. And there it's becoming lethargic, and in the top right, that's its cocoon, its chrysalis when it weaves it, and it's hanging from that branch by silken threads that are as strong as spider silk, which is like 30 times as strong as steel. So pretty secure there. And then in the lower thing, there's our teenager in the cocoon for long enough that, you see how dark the bottom of the cocoon looks? That's an eastern black swallowtail caterpillar. That's adult caterpillar starting. And one day, in this imagining, you wake with urges you've never known before, not for food, for something you can't define, something outside your cocoon. You struggle, you split the covering, and you begin to pull yourself out into the air, only you're not the you remember being. Your munching jaws have disappeared. Your dozens of stumpy legs are now 6 slender ones with distinct joints and clasping feet. Your body is slimmer. Your antennae are longer and more flexible. Your eyes have moved to closer on the top of your head and have become more complex. Your jaws have been replaced by a hair-thin proboscis, which is a fancy word for a very long hair-like tongue that is rolled up under your upper jaw that functions like a straw. Your appetite is gone too, but you don't notice that yet because you're so preoccupied by these weird feeling lumps of tissue on your back. You pump your muscles, your back muscles. A butterfly or a moth is somewhere around between 20% of their body weight is flight muscles to 30 to 35%, depending upon whether they flutter or hover. Hovering takes bigger muscles. Fluid pumps into the tissue wads as you pump more, the wads lift off your back and begin to straighten out. And then here, here they are starting to straighten out and look like wings. But when this kid came out of the chrysalis, they were just like you'd wadded up wet Kleenexes on its back. You can't imagine how weird that must feel. When you pump your back muscles, you rest, you pump your back muscles, and suddenly, whoa, you're airborne. You're flying. You're above the branch you were on before. And that's so weird that you quit pumping and you drop back to the branch and you cling with your new feet and you rest for a little bit. It's a lot to adjust to, but the feeling of being airborne is intoxicating. And pretty quickly you're flying off, sniffing enticing smells with your antennae and searching intently for one you will recognize, a partner, something you've never had before. How does a caterpillar know how to metamorphose? It's just like teenagers. Hormone levels do the signal, and then everything gets creepy and weird and cranky and, difficult. As the caterpillar is inside that chrysalis, when it's in there, right in this guy, and here, what's happening is that cells are dying. Some of them are being scrubbed out. Some of them are being repurposed. Their contents are being repurposed. We don't know how to do that. Our cells die, and our immune system cleans them up and takes the contents out of our bodies. Caterpillars can reuse them. They can recycle them. And in fact, they change purpose. So muscle fibers separate and are reformed. Nerve fibers become different kinds of nerve fibers. Gut tissue begins to grow different organs. Eyes migrate, jaws reform, that proboscis forms. Metamorphosis is kind of like carefully demolishing a house and saving every board and window and screw and hinge and putting it back together as an airplane. It's not a simple thing. It's a really magical thing that happens in metamorphosis. So, all right, fourth fantastical thing. We know now that plants talk. Okay, we can accept that. They also behave. And this is something that really, if I had said in grad school X number of years ago that, yeah, I watched a plant behave in response to its environment, that would have killed my career. I would have been off in the lunatic fringe right away. And I think it's because we as humans define behavior as what we do. It's like we define a brain as the organ we have. And the more we open up our perspective and recognize that if there's analysis going on in memory, a brain might not have to look like the organ that's in our heads, that 7 pounds worth of tissue. Behavior is the same thing. We have been totally biased against plants because we don't see them moving, so thus they must not be behaving. They're rooted in place. They're just kind of at the mercy of their environment. They get buffeted around and survive if they can. Not so. Plants don't behave the way we do, but they do behave in that they actively engineer their responses to what's going on in their world to change the outcome. That's behavior. So the simplest form of behavior, of course, is moving. And by the way, this is a sunflower. You all know that. And what's going on here, you may not know that a sunflower is actually a complex composite of flowers. The things that look like petals around the edge are actually individual flowers. Each one has a single petal-like appendage, and there's a flower at its base. And then the center is dozens of flowers packed together in a spiral fashion because that's most space efficient. And this dark part is where the bees are roosting. This is first thing in the morning at sunrise, and those bees have slept there all night, and we'll get into why they did that in a minute. But plants move. Plants move in all sorts of ways, and I'm going to skip past this slide, but I want to talk to you about this really quickly. That's a Hunt's bumblebee. It's one of our native bumblebees. This is a Ribes odoratum, a clove-scented currant, which is one of our native currants, and they're super, super fragrant. And I was planting a pollinator garden at a farm on the west slope, and I had just planted this clove-scented currant. I turned around to plant the other clove-scented currant, and I heard a bumblebee go by me. And it was that Hunt's bumblebee. And the bumblebee was flying like this, and honing in on the communication from that clove-scented currant. And I don't know how far away that Hunt's bumblebee was, but I can tell you that they can track more than 100 yards, that kind of smell, because their antennae are way more sensitive than our noses are. So that clove-scented currant, as soon as it was in the ground, called in a pollinator to pollinate it. Very cool. And also very instant. So sunflowers are an excellent example of plant movement, and something we didn't realize until fairly recently. In Spanish, a sunflower is girasol, from the verb girar, which means to move, and sol from sun, turning with the sun. Sunflowers actually, when they're growing their flower stalks with that big composite flower, the shady side of the stalk, the cells lengthen faster than the sunny side, and so you get that tilted flower head. Why? Well, a couple of things. They also can follow the sun's movement over the course of a day when the flower head is forming. Because, as you can see, here's a sunflower bee zamming in to pollinate the head. That dark central head gathers heat. It is basically a solar absorber. And why would you want to gather heat? Well, if your pollinators are bees that are basically solitary, native bees that are basically solitary, they need a place to sleep at night. And so if you give them a warm landing pad to sleep in at night, they'll still be there in the morning to pollinate your hundreds of flowers. That's called pollinator loyalty. And it's actually a whole field of plant behavior is how flowering plants reward their pollinators for hanging out with them and pollinating all their flowers. So the other thing that happens when you have a stalk that bends over a little bit is in a storm, it forms kind of an umbrella, and under these outer ray flowers in the center of the sunflower, I counted 4 sunflower bees, 2 bumblebees, and 1, I think it was a predatory wasp. And they were all sheltering in there under, it was actually, this is in Wyoming at home. It was a summer snowstorm. July, Cody. We had a wet snow. Weather. But the sunflower was giving its pollinators shelter as a way of rewarding them for pollinating its flowers so that they would continue to do that. So big win-win there. And the other thing that having a slightly bent over stalk does if you're a flower that's going to have multiple seeds is it rewards your favorite seed dispersers, which are goldfinches and pine siskins. They have beaks that can pop the seeds out of the sunflower, and they're messy feeders. So about 1/3 of the seeds they pop out, they drop on the ground right below the sunflower. Perfect. If you're an annual plant and the parent plant's going to die anyway, you're fine with having your kids right there under you because you know it's a good place to grow. So you enlist, you make your seed heads perfect for goldfinches and siskins to clamber around on like mini parrots. So plants move. It's a very amazing thing. And you know, who has houseplants here? You know that plants move because in slow motion, because when you have a plant next to a window, it either likes that much light or doesn't. It'll either grow toward that light or away. That's why we rotate our houseplants, right? You can see that in a forest by how a tree grows. The branches on this side are dead. Why is that? Because the neighboring tree grew into its light and they died. But the branches on this side are alive because there's still enough light to make food from. So the tree is migrating its energy over toward the light. It's not fast, but you can see it in time-lapse photography. In some plants, you can see it over the course of a day. Big sagebrush, because it keeps its leaves all year long, it rotates the leaves over the course of a day so that they won't dry out in the sun and wind, but they can still collect enough solar energy to produce food. So a big sagebrush leaves will rotate over the course of the day to optimize loss of water from the sun and wind, to minimize loss of water from the sun and wind and optimize sun exposure. And if you set a time-lapse camera on one, you watch the leaves as they rotate over the course of the day. Who knew? That's behavior. So the really complex behavior is the dance that happens between plants and the insects who pollinate them. And these lupins are a really fun example. There's a couple of different behaviors going on in these beautiful lupins. See these faint lines? These are called the keel petals, these petals that come together. There's two of them. You're only seeing one side. Those lines, the way an insect sees them, and insects see ultraviolet light, which we don't see, they look really bright like landing lights on an airport runway at night, and they're telling the bee, and these are mostly pollinated by bumblebees, to land right there. Now, when a bee has not landed there, it's closed. This one has just had a bee land on it, and there's this thing sticking out. That's the pistil, the female part of the flower. So when the bee lands there, the pistil pops out, the bee hits it with their fuzzy body and drops pollen from another lupin on it and pollinates it. And then if the bee stays a little longer, its stamens pop out too. And it can pick up pollen to carry on to the next flower and also carry home to feed its babies. So those lines are part of the plant's behavior. They're saying to the pollinator, land here, right here. Right here, and then the petals pop apart, the pistil pops out, and then the stamens pop out after that. So a little bit of complex signaling going on there, but then it gets even more fun. See how dark these upper petals are on the lower flowers? That's the banner petal, named because it's like the advertisement petal. It's the banner. Well, up at the top, they're pale. See how pale these guys are? And then they get really dark by down there. The pale ones, the flowers haven't been pollinating. They're still producing nectar and pollen for the insects. The dark ones have been pollinated, and nectar and pollen is really energetically expensive to produce. It's exhausting. It takes a lot of their reserves. So they quit producing it after they've been pollinated. So they're saying to the bees, don't bother with me. I'm done. I'm over. I'm not producing any of your food. I'm not going to reward you. Go up here and check out these flowers. That's, pretty smart. So if you watch a bee foraging in flowers like these, you'll see the bee fly up and not go in, not land, not do anything, because it's getting the signal that I don't have your reward. Just pass me by, go on to the next. Or it's smelling the fragrances of other bees that have already been to that flower and taken the nectar and pollen. Either way, it's like, meh, not going to that one, going to the next. All this stuff that we don't smell because our noses are just kind of boring. So flowers also, and I don't know if I have a photograph of that. I don't. Flowers also, you know this, flowers wilt after they've been pollinated. They crumple up, their petals crumple up into a wad. Evening primroses are the best example. They look like wet tissues somebody left behind. And they also change color, like the lupin, when they've been pollinated. Some flower petals go from like white to orange when they've been pollinated. Some petals go from orange to white. But either way, it's a signal to their partners to not bother. Just go on to the next flower. I'm already done. Plants also listen. Plants listen even though they have no organs that we recognize as ears. And we know this because of evening primroses. Do y'all recognize those guys? This is not the species that the research was done on, but it turns out an Israeli scientist, Lilac Hadani, in the Negev desert was looking at evening primrose flowers similar to these and thought to herself, that's like a dish antenna. I wonder if they use sound as a signal, because it's very like the kind of a radio antenna, which concentrates sound. And she thought, I wonder if we can tell if they use sound and if they communicate with their pollinators that way. Well, it turns out that if you're Laila Khadani and her colleagues, you find this out by taking little broadcasters. First, you figure out who the favorite pollinator of the flower is, and that would be sphinx moths, the ones that hover and have the big furry bodies, and the long proboscis. Then you figure out what the hovering, what hertz, what frequency the hovering of sphinx moths is. It would be between 200 and 500 hertz if you're a sound engineer. And you broadcast that at the flowers and you see if they respond. Turns out, is this crazy or what? Right? It turns out that they do. The petals actually vibrate only in that range of frequencies. The petals vibrate. And then they wanted to know, well, does that vibration mean something to the plant? And how would you figure that out? Well, the way they figured it out was they broadcast the vibration to some plants and not to others, and then they checked the sugar content of their nectar immediately afterwards. And it turns out if you were a Drummond's evening primrose in the Negev desert and someone broadcast sound waves in the frequency of a hovering sphinx moth at you, within 3 minutes, you bump up the sugar content of your nectar from 1% to 3%. Which does not sound like a really big deal, honestly, but if you bump it up to 4%, it's too viscous for the sphinx moths to suck up in their proboscis. 3% is exactly energetically what they need to power their hovering flight. But it takes a lot of energy for the plant to produce nectar at 3%, and it spoils more easily. Bacteria get into it, and so they don't do it all the time. They only do it when they hear the vibrations of their favorite pollinator, or the scientists tricking them into thinking it's the vibrations of their favorite pollinator. And you can imagine the plants going like, what? I just put all that effort and it's just a stupid transmitter. The things we do for science. If you're a sphinx moth and you're flying in the cooler temperatures of evening, you need higher sugar. You need a higher percentage of sugar in your nectar to give your flight muscles enough energy to keep you hovering. And also, before you start flying, you shiver your flight muscles asynchronously out of rhythm, so your wings don't move, but your body warms up, and then you're warm enough to fly. So I'm going to go back all the way to the beginning. Sorry, this is weird, but I want to show that sphinx moth, so you know, whoops, there we are. Look at that. That is a sphinx moth. There it is, furry body, hovering wings, and this is what I've been calling the proboscis. That's the straw that those moths drink out of the flowers with. So imagine this. You're a sphinx moth. You're hovering. It's evening. You're warm. You're good. You smell your preferred flower. You're flying in there. You have your straw rolled up under your upper lip. Hovering, hovering, hovering. You get close to the flower and you want to drink, so you start unrolling it, and while hovering, you're going to stick it in that flower while hovering and sip nectar. Do not try that at home. I don't think it would end well. I know it wouldn't for me. There's no way I could get there. All right. So plants and pollinators have this long relationship, and there's a lot of complex stuff that happens with them. And I put this slide in here to say, okay, so you can do this with Rocky Mountain penstemon. It's got a fairly open flower tube, and you can aim that straw in there, not such a big deal. But imagine trying to go in there while hovering, and you've got to reach about 3 feet down to get to the nectar while hovering, and then sip and breathe while you're doing that, and keep hovering. So it's a complex dance that they have. Okay, plants hunt. There are plants that are vampires, and this is one of them. You see all these sort of yellowy, orangey, straw-like stems and the little ivory flower clusters? They are all attached to this green plant underneath. They are not green themselves. Those are dodders, great name, D-O-D-D-E-R. They are the most obvious plant hunters. A daughter seed germinates, and it has roots for about 10 days, never grows leaves, never has any green pigment, never knows how to make its own food because it doesn't need to. It germinates, and this wire-like stalk in time-lapse photography does this thing, like a snake hunting for its prey, only this plant is sniffing, not trying to find heat. And it sniffs and sniffs and sniffs and sniffs, and when it smells its preferred plant, it does this, circles around the stem. And daughters are related to morning glories, our inoffensive, wonderful morning glories, same family. It curls around the stem like a morning glory, but it has teeth. They're called haustoria. It pierces the stem with its teeth and starts drinking its blood. Well, okay, it's sap. Water and sugar, it's all the daughter needs. Doesn't have to produce its own food. In time-lapse photography, it'll creep you out. Seriously, this stem in the air is doing this thing, circling, looking, sniffing, and then suddenly it's doing this, and then more stems sprout, and more daughter vines are circling, looking for their prey. In this case, you gotta love it. Do y'all know puncture vine or goat head? This daughter is parasitizing a goat head. Yeah. Go daughter. Plants, and I don't have a slide for this because I didn't have a picture of what they do underground, but plants hook up underground. They are completely shameless. They hook up with fungi and use the fungi. They go into a cooperative relationship with fungal threads and make a network underground. Suzanne Simard, a forest ecologist in British Columbia, discovered the wood wide web. It's a fungal network that connects the plants in a forest underground. And it's a real true network. There are nodes. The larger trees, which she calls mother trees, control the traffic on the nodes. And the traffic is water, sugars, and the chemicals of plant communication and information. And so this isn't just like the big old Douglas firs in these big forests of the BC, sharing information with each other. This is almost all the trees and other plants in the forest sharing information via these threads of fungus underground. They're like mushroom roots, basically. And they're speaking to each other. And in fact, it turns out Suzanne over decades has done all these cool experiments with her colleagues and her students. If you cut down one of the mother trees and leave the stump, the network preferentially sends water and sugars to that stump to keep it alive as one of the controlling nodes in the whole community network. If an area of seedlings is not doing well, the network sends it extra water and sugars and insect repellents and things like that it needs to succeed. So this is a true underground plant information and food network. And it turns out that it's not just found, these networks aren't just found in forests. We have them in our prairies, we have them in our shrublands, we have them in our pinyon juniper woodlands. They are everywhere under the surface. You can dig under the soil surface and find these mats of fungal threads. Where we don't find them, and this is interesting, is in our gardens and our planted domestic landscapes and our agricultural landscapes. Because it seems a lot of our agricultural plants are from somewhere else, and they don't know the fungi in the soil where they're planted. They don't have a relationship, and they don't bring with them enough of their own fungi to create those networks. And the same thing is true in our gardens. A lot of our favorite garden plants are non-native plants, and they don't know the soil microbes and the fungi where we plant them. And so they're there all by themselves. It goes back to that thing I was first talking about. You are not alone. We are in relationship with all of these other critters. Well, plants are too. And if they don't have their other microscopic critters, in particular the fungi, they don't do as well. So we have to add a lot of water and fertilizer so they're happy and do well. So a big area of research in plant biology right now is how do we inoculate soils for farm crops and for our gardens and our domestic landscapes with the right funguses so that they grow a cooperative network underground, because they work as a community. They don't work as individuals. And that is a metaphor. I deal in metaphor. I are a writer. We humans need to take that metaphor to heart. We are not islands. We don't do well as islands. Nobody, nor does anybody else in the world. Okay, that was the end of the sermon. Sorry. I get carried away sometimes. What else do we have? Let's see. The wonderful thing about getting older is that you might forget what you were thinking of 10 minutes ago, but you'll remember your childhood really vividly. I can forget where I am in the middle of a talk. I want to give you just a few tidbits from new research. And sorry that this is a lot about plants, but I'm a plant nerd. That's my life. Plants are my people. So they're what I know best. A couple of really cool things that have come up in plant ecology recently are that we now know that seeds have what are called, what do they call them? Oh, well, we'll call them a brain. Seeds have essentially, they're each encoded, each kind of plant encodes its seeds with the knowledge it needs to sprout only when the conditions are right. And if you think about it, a seed is a plant's kid. And they don't want their kids sprouting and growing up and wasting their life. They want them to sprout when things are good for them, which is different for every kind of plant. So there are plants like the Indian paintbrush in this slide, this gorgeous red flowers growing next to a big sagebrush. There are plants who their seeds will only sprout when they can smell the fragrances that their partner plants give off under the soil. So the seed will just sit there, and in the case of some plants, that could be for years, decades, or even a century or more, until the right plant fragrances are smellable in the soil. So you can plant an Indian paintbrush seed anywhere you want, and it will only sprout if there is a nearby sagebrush or blue grama grass or fringe sage or prairie sage, so that it can develop a cooperative relationship with its roots. Nursery people discovered this to their immense frustration. It's very hard to propagate big sagebrush unless you inoculate the pot with the seeds of one of its partners. You have to grow them together. Some plants won't sprout unless, for instance, they smell the fragrances of a burned forest or a burned shrubland. California chaparral, the shrublands along the California coast, many of those plants have to have particular compounds in smoke that are in the soil before the seeds will sprout. Very specific stuff. It's not just add water, make sure it's frozen over the winter. There's a bunch of very specific conditions. One of the coolest is that plants have to go through a particular animal's digestive system and be excreted in a pat of fertilizer before they'll germinate. And wild chilies are a great example of that. All of our chilies come from chiltepines, the little tiny red chili fruits that are native to the Sonoran Desert in northern Mexico and southern Arizona. And they grow in a little shrub, and the chili plants stick up, and they're bright red, which is a wavelength of color that birds see preferentially. And they grow in under the shade, the dappled shade of desert mesquite trees and palo verde trees. So a bird comes along, sees that red fruit, picks it off the shrub, eats it, but birds don't have teeth, so they don't chew up the seeds when they do. The seeds go right through their digestive system, and the next time the bird perches and, poops, the seed lands just where it wants to grow, in the shade of a desert tree, in a pat of bird fertilizer. Chiltepines don't want mammals like us to eat them because we have these teeth, these things, which grind up their seeds. So chiltepines developed a chemical called capsaicin that actually has no flavor or color, but it tweaks mammal nerve endings and makes us feel pain. So when we bite into a chili, we're like, hurts. A bird, not affected at all. But we would grind up their seeds, and a bird won't. And we think plants are stupid. I'm going to skip the plant memory because I just want to tell you one more thing. The coolest new research to me, because we're having big fires in the West, our mega fires, is that what we've recently discovered is that there's a group of fungi called pyrophilus, or fire-loving fungi, so they're like the mushrooms and all that, who will actually sprout only in response to a serious forest fire, the kind that sear the soil and cause it to develop a waxy coating and make it repel water. And these fungi sprout and they eat that waxy coating and they turn it into compounds that fertilize the soil. They also can consume charcoal, which is useful carbon to the forest, but not very, it's pretty decay resistant. And these fungi will also eat charcoal. So a whole thing with fire rehab now is how do we get the right fungi into the forest soils after they've burned so that the fungi help us rehab the soils. So if you take anything from this talk, I want you to take away this idea that life is a communal endeavor, and also the idea that we humans have a super important role in life, but it may not be the one we think. And I'm going to read you a little bit from this book I wrote called The San Luis Valley, Sand Dunes and Sandhill Cranes, which is my love song to a part of Colorado that just scared the snot out of me when I used to live next to it, because it's big and it's wild and it's windy and difficult. But I spent sort of a dream assignment for a writer. University of Arizona Press called me and said, so pick a place in Colorado and write 45,000 words about it, and pick a photographer you want to work with and have them come photograph it with you. You don't have to respond to each other's work. You just go out together and see what happens. I mean, it's like this dream assignment. And they said, well, it has to have some natural history and some human history in, but otherwise, whatever you want. Well, in contemplating this place that really honestly scared the heck out of me, I came to realize something about humans and how we can belong. In comparison with other species, humans are not particularly impressive. We have no fins to propel us. Sorry, I almost forgot to switch the slide. We have no fins to propel us from stream to ocean and back again, like salmon, who can smell their way home from the ocean to the stream where they were born. No jaws strong enough to crack deer vertebrae in one bite. No wings to power us thousands of feet into the air. No idea of how to metamorphose from caterpillar to butterfly, much less wait out inhospitable decades as seeds. We have big brains, but they can be as much curse as blessing, leading us to imagine ourselves superior to the rest of life. What we do best comes not from our heads, but our hearts. From an ineffable impulse that resists logic and definition and calculation, love. Love is what connects us to the rest of the living world, the sacred urging from within that guides our best steps in the dance of life. And I will say only one thing about that quote. If when I had written it, I had realized how many times I would read it out loud, I would never have paired the words ineffable and impulse, because they do not trip off the tongue easily. That's all. I'd be happy to answer questions.
So we have a couple microphones going around. So if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll
There's a hand back there. I see.
Okay, Deborah. And if the microphone doesn't get to you in time, we'll try to repeat the question so everyone can hear.
I can do that. Can you
What an amazing talk, by the way. Thank you. You're
and I
amazing.
do want to say that there are books in the library, and all proceeds from the book sales, I've donated them, go to BeeChicas and the Library Foundation. So. So you want to shout out your question?
I think there was something on EcoWatch that said, and the fires in Australia were so severe for climate disaster that most of the organic material was burned down to stone or the rock below.
And that actually,
There's still hope that, because some places you read about how there's things that live within the cracks and rocks and stuff, so is there still hope for microbes and fungi even if we overheat?
so he said that on EcoWatch there was something about the fires in Australia that are so severe they're burning actually down to the rock And there are plants, there are seeds, there are microbes, there are lichens who exist not only in the cracks in the rock, but also in the spaces between the crystals in the rock, in sandstone. So yes, there is hope for things like that. It's a very severe thing to happen. I mean, what's happening with climate change is challenging all systems, but that doesn't mean they don't have resilience. One of the things, the more that I read about new research, I feel much more hopeful than I used to about the resilience of this planet. It's not that life is going to exist in the form that we might like best, but life is amazingly, amazingly creative and resilient. And so even in places where fires burn right down beyond the mineral soil to the rocks below, there will still be life there. It's just going to be a long time before it looks like what we hope it would look like. But that doesn't mean life is gone, which I think is hopeful, at least partly. Yeah. So one of the things as someone who does ecological restoration that I've learned is that we can't expect it to happen on our timescale or the way we'd like it to happen. So when I'm working with, say, a degraded industrial area, and the first thing I do is come in and census who's there and who's not, and what's going on. And I work at removing the invasive plants, those plants that, when we use the term weed in gardening, we're talking about a plant we don't like. But in ecology, when we use the term weed, we're talking about the playground bullies of the world, those that don't play well with others, because it's all about the community's health and function. And if a plant doesn't have relationships and can't play well with others, and it's not part of that community, it may not be able to stay to get the community's health back. So the first thing I do is go and do an inventory and look at what's there. And then I start working at removing those plants that are trying to take over and preventing the community from regaining its health. And then I start working at restoring native relationships, the relationships between the native plants and the pollinators and the grazers and the thises and thatses, all of the players in a community. And in doing that, not everybody takes hold that I want to take hold. You know, I'm hoping it'll look like something like this, and what I get is something like this, but it's functioning, and there's insects, and there's all sorts of cool relationships rebuilding. Well, that's what matters. It's the community rebuilding itself, not my vision of what it should look like, and not my time scale either. I mean, it may be centuries in some cases before communities repair themselves from the kinds of damage of severe fires and other climate change-induced damage. But life has those centuries. We individual humans don't, but life on Earth as a whole has that kind of time scale. Other questions, thoughts, cat calls, jokes? Yes?
You mentioned how you plant Rocky Mountain bee plant in your vegetable garden with your tomatoes to promote pollination and things. And I wonder if you could talk a little more about what you do in that sort of seasonal instance. What other plant relationships or soil relationships you might try to sort of manipulate?
So I mentioned planting Rocky Mountain bee plant, which is a native annual wildflower, in my vegetable garden as a way to promote both pollinators and also parasitic wasps to do their thing with caterpillars. And she asked what other relationships might I try to promote in that kind of seasonal short term, and you didn't use that word, but I'm going to use that, kind of community building. So when you build an edible garden, you're usually working with annual plants, and that's a short-term community, but you're trying to promote the healthiest community possible. So things that I do are, I look at which annual wildflowers are attracting the most pollinators and the most parasitic wasps and the other insects who work with controlling levels of different insects and keeping them in balance. So I look at, like, Rocky Mountain bee plant is one of my favorites, and it's the easiest. I also plant some perennial wildflowers, and favorites of those would be, what else have I planted in my gardens? Another annual would be Corydalis aurea golden smoke, which is a little beautiful relative of garden bleeding hearts, but it's yellow, and it has ferny leaves, and it's another annual. I seed that in because it's good for early it's good for actually promoting ants, which are seed dispersers and cleaners, uppers. They're sanitation engineers, and they're very important in the garden in keeping non-beneficial fungi down and things like that. So I look at annual wildflowers and I plant those. And for soil health, I actually have looked for an inoculant that I like for years, and I finally realized that in my garden beds I just include some native soil because, hello, it comes with all those microbes. So I will always mix in native soil. I don't, in any of my native plant gardens, amend the soil at all. I leave it native because that's what our native plants are used to. But in my vegetable gardens, I always work in native soil. And sometimes as much as a third native soil. No matter how cruddy it may seem to me, it's got all the microbes, it's got all the beneficial stuff that help the garden plants make a healthy community. So, and we get taught that, native soil is dirt. I've been rehabbing houses as a part-time income since my husband died of brain cancer about 13 years ago, and I've moved through about 10 houses in that time. I pick a house that needs love and give it a new story, and I rehab the land around it at the same time. And one of the things I've learned by doing that is potting soil is not earth. I have a small garden now, a courtyard garden and a back rock garden by my house outside Santa Fe, and I live in a area where we're on groundwater, and so we're not allowed to have lawns. We don't fence. It's a beautiful, beautiful development of 2,200 lots, about 6,000 people live there, and we still have all the native prairie around our houses. And we have little courtyard gardens. And the 94-year-old lady, the marvelous lady who I bought the house from, dug out in the garden beds in the courtyard and the rock garden, she dug out the native soil and she put in potting soil. And the soil dried out. We're in a drought. We're in extreme drought now. And the soil dried out so badly this winter that I have taken to digging shovelfuls of native soil out from outside my courtyard and integrating them back into the gardens so that I can even get it to hold any water. Potting soil doesn't come with all the microbes, it doesn't come with all the other beings, it doesn't come with all the minerals. It's fine for in pots, although I dig native soil in my pots too. But it does not make garden beds. So don't buy yourself bales of potting soil and try to make gardens out of them. It's just a bad idea. Anyway, thank you all. One more question? Yes? Cool.
Hi, Susan. You've talked about the frequency that the different pollinators exhibit when they approach plants. Is there any evidence that some of them mimic? So if someone wants that more sugar, will it change? Will something that's not a sphinx moth change its frequency?
That's a very interesting question, and there is not, as far as I know, any research about that. But here's the problem with that. Mimicking is fine with coloration and pattern, but if you are, say a big bee, a carpenter bee, or a big bumblebee, your wings are not constructed the same way as a sphinx moth's wings are, and so you would be physically unable to generate the same sound waves at the same frequency as a sphinx moth. But it's certainly I would be trying if I was, why not? What the heck? But think about it, if you think about a bee's wings, they're that membranous, almost cellophane-like wings, and a sphinx moth's wings are, can I do this quickly? Probably not. Oops, sorry. Oh no, I messed it up. No, I'm not going to be able to do that. A sphinx moth's wings are have scales on them like a butterfly. And so they're going to, oh, thank you. There it is. So you can't see those very well because it's hovering, but you see they're not membranous like a dragonfly or a bee's wings. So you're not going to be able to generate the same sound waves, although you might actually try. And dragonflies remind me, and a fantastical thing. Did you know that dragonflies migrate? They're actually migrating right now. Some of the big darners and the other big dragonflies, and they'll go. And we know this because on the East Coast, someone who was studying bird migration through Cape May and some of the other really important bird migration areas on the East Coast noticed hundreds of dragonflies flying by as they were banding birds, and we're like, what are they doing? So, radio transmitters come in little tiny packages now, and they made harnesses and put little transmitters on the dragonfly backs. I'm not kidding. It's like little teeny backpacks. And they discovered that some species of the big dragonflies migrate for as much as 100 or 200 miles. Who would guess? And add to that harvester ants, the ant mounds that people love to hate because they will sting you. They're touchy gals. Harvester ants will go 250 yards from their nest to gather seeds. There are seed gathering ants, and they're really important in distributing plant seeds. Some plants grow seeds with an edible handle, but a hard seed coat, and the harvester ant will go forage away from her nest looking for seeds for the ant colony, and she'll pick up one with an edible handle, and she'll carry it by the handle, chewing on it while she does, and when she gets done with the handle, the seed coat is too hard for her jaws to penetrate, and she drops it. And she might have just carried it 20 yards from the parent plant. How cool is that? They also can carry 10 times their weight. I want you not to try that at home. So, the world is full of cool stuff. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was an amazing talk. I loved every single story, and I want to stay here for 2 more hours and hear more and more. But we might be able to keep Susan out in the lobby for a couple more minutes signing books if you would like to join us out in the foyer. But thank you. What a kickoff.